We have a guest with us today, Taylor Gallman. Thanks for being here. Taylor, I know two of your kids. I don't know your two older kids, but I know Nathan and Andrea. And I can tell you that for years and years now, I've heard what great kids they were. And you can ask anybody around about either one of those, your kids, and they'll say wonderful things. They're very talented, very kind, very committed. And so I thought it'd be great to have a dad who has some fruit to prove that he knows what he's doing. So we're happy that you're here. We got a really interesting story. I'm going to hold off on it just a little bit about something that happened with you and your dad that I find just blows your mind. We'll hold off on that for a little bit, but I guess if I can just get you to tell me a little bit about your family now, your kids, your wife, and what you're doing now.
Well, I'm a retired United Methodist pastor, and I have 4 children, 2 older children, by one wife who got bone marrow cancer and died, and I kind of thought my world had ended.
Yeah.
But God turned that around. He changed my life and let me meet a young lady in seminary.
Okay.
A place I never wanted to go. To make that statement is something that you need to understand. I was a failure all my life.
Wow.
When I graduated high school, the only way I graduated was to cheat. And my dad and I didn't have a great relationship. We had a pretty terrible relationship.
Wow.
And I did everything I could to get away from him until I graduated college and found out that my dad was a pretty decent guy.
Wow.
He was a United Methodist pastor, became a United Methodist evangelist, and before he died, he reached over 350 young men and women and brought them into full-time Christian service.
Wow. So what do you think was the conflict? You know, one of the populations we want to reach is young men who haven't had a great experience growing up. What was the conflict between you and your dad early on?
Well, I felt that my dad didn't have time for me. He had time for everybody else, but he didn't have time for me. And I was a difficult kid. I have dyslexia, and both of my parents were genius, and
wow.
I couldn't spell my name right. And so I felt like that they just, my brother, they loved my brother, they loved my sister, but they just tolerated me.
So you felt like the black sheep of the family. You didn't feel like you fit in.
There was no feeling like that. That's what I was. They made it clear that I was, they couldn't figure me out.
Huh.
They couldn't figure out why I was so rebellious, why I was the way I was, why I couldn't write because I see backwards.
Yeah.
And so it made no sense to them, but I could do anything I wanted to do. And so they knew I wasn't dumb. It was just that they couldn't figure me out, and I couldn't figure them.
So they were frustrated with this child that they couldn't figure out, and you were frustrated with the parents that you couldn't figure out. And I think that's a case with a lot of kids nowadays. So what was your mindset, your mentality? What got you through that?
Well, after being rebellious for many years, I finally met someone that would sit down and talk to me, and they talked to me about God. And that seems strange to have. My daddy was a pastor.
Yeah.
He was an evangelist. My mother was also a pastor. She was the first woman pastor in Mississippi.
Wow.
In the United Methodist Church. But they didn't know how to deal with me. They didn't know how to comprehend the way I was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you have dyslexia, you don't know that you can't read.
Right.
And so it made them question everything about who I was. I had a brother that was a genius, a sister that was, everything in college, but then I was the third one.
So you were the misfit. You were the misfit. You were the kid that wasn't going to accomplish anything. That's was right. Always confused about everything. Felt like your parents didn't really love you. Didn't, just kind of pushed you aside. And so many kids, I think, go through that. So many of the guys that I had at the ranch feel that deep inside. I didn't know that about your story until just now, but that all changed at some point, and I want to get there in just a minute. But somehow or another, you figured out a way to what I call flip the script. You figured out a way to be the parent that you always wished you had, I suppose.
Well,
with your own kids.
When I got married, I made a vow to myself that I would never be like my parents.
Wow.
And for years, my parents and I just didn't communicate on a level of understanding. And finally, I just got tired of it.
Yeah.
And I went to my dad and I said, we've got to fix this.
Wow.
And it was difficult.
So you actually went to him and formally said, Dad, we've got a problem.
That's right.
We got to fix that.
And I just finally went to him and said, I don't know why you hate me. And he looked at me and started crying. He said, I don't hate you. I don't understand you. And I said, so not understanding me means that you can't help me? And he finally got it. He started crying.
Really?
And that was the time that we came together and began to understand that we'd both made some great mistakes.
Wow.
And my dad and I became close friends. And I could tell him anything.
Wow.
But we had to get past the fact that I wasn't stupid. I just couldn't read.
So how old were you when that took place?
18.
So you spent 18 years and basically in misery, it sounds like, thinking you were the reject of the family, thinking that they didn't love you. And your dad spent 18 years thinking that you didn't love him.
That's right.
So when you went to talk to him and he started crying, do you think that was the first time that he really realized that his son really does love, my son does love me and wants to have a relationship with me? You think it took him that long to figure that out?
Well, I just think he was so busy and he put it out of his mind.
How did that affect you when you had your own family? How did those emotions and those memories affect what you did in terms of raising your own kids?
When I finally figured out that my dad really loved me and that they just didn't understand me, I promised myself I would never treat my kids, my 4 children, the way that I was treated, that I would talk to them, that I would be in their life.
Wow.
And that I wanted to be a part of them. And that no matter what they did could never define my love for them.
Wow. Unconditional love.
And so I learned how to be a parent by being a terrible kid. But it started making sense when I started putting his puzzle together. He lost his dad when he was 3 years old.
Oh, really?
And he lost his mother when he graduated from high school.
So he really didn't have that role model either.
No.
He was trying to figure this thing out as he went. And some of us are so blessed with grandparents and great-grandparents and a father, and then some of us don't have any of that. My grandfather, I was telling you earlier, his dad passed away before he was born, and so he had to figure it out, just like your dad had to figure it out, just like you had to figure it out. But the good news is, and this is the message I think I want to send to our listeners, is that there is a way to figure it out. You flip the script. You change the trajectory of your family But it took you making a conscious decision to one thing, say, I want to make things right with my own dad. And then you made the second conscious decision, which was, I'm going to be a good dad.
That's right.
This desk where we're sitting was built by you and Nathan, your son.
That's right.
So Nathan was so excited. By the way, this desk was made out of lumber that we cut at Eagle Rock Ranch right off the facility. And when I called Nathan and said, "Hey man, we need to build a desk," he immediately said, "I'd love to do that with my dad." So apparently, along the way, you figured out that's one of your, I guess you'd say, love languages is time with your kids. So tell me about that. We know you built this desk, but tell me about some other things that you did with your 3 boys and 1 girl.
That's right. Well, I tried to make time for them. I tried to be in their life, no matter what, and I might have not done it the right way, but I wanted to be a part of their life, and I wanted them to be able to come to me and talk to me about anything, and I didn't know how to do that, but I did not want my children to grow up not knowing their father loved them with all his heart. And that's, I think, one of the most important factors in families today. Kids don't know because we don't tell them. And I did not want my kids to grow up and not hear that I loved them.
So you told them verbally.
That's right.
But you also told them in other ways.
That's right.
What kind of things did you and your older boys are a good bit older than Nathan and Andrea. So what kind of things did you do with them to kind of demonstrate to them that you loved them?
Well, I would take them hunting, fishing. We'd go out and split wood together. We would do things together, and I'm more of a action kind of person than a talking kind of person.
Okay.
But I never would let my kids go to sleep without telling them I love them.
Wow. And Nathan's behind the camera shaking his head. Yes, he agrees with that.
I mean, it's one thing to show your love.
Right.
But when you can't say your love, I think that the verbal understanding of being able to tell my children, my family, I love them.
Yeah.
And not just say, well, for example, I would go to my dad, I'd say, I love you. He'd say, yeah, me too.
How'd that make you feel?
It made me feel terrible because that wasn't the response I wanted. He couldn't tell me he loved me. And when we finally had the showdown, I told him that.
Yeah.
And we ended up in tears together. And he began to understand that I wasn't like my brother or my sister. I wasn't like the rest of the family because of my dyslexia. And that they could see things in ways that I could never see.
Yeah. So it took him a while to figure it out. Do you
did.
remember the first time your dad told you he loved you?
I can remember that I walked in his house and sat down with him and told him that I loved him. And he looked at me very strangely and said, well, son, and now you have to understand that was probably one of the first times I ever heard that word.
Son.
I love you too.
Wow.
And I get emotional about it. But when you are 18 years old and you hadn't heard those words, it's quite an impact on your life.
Yeah. So I think there's a strong message for guys who may be out there and you're struggling because your dad had never told you he loves you. And maybe he's a little distant maybe he's a little harsh. There's hope. And what Taylor is saying is your dad really did love you the whole time. He just didn't know how to say it. He didn't know how to express it. He didn't understand. I hear that from a lot of guys. I know when I sat down with Nathan the very first time we met to talk about this project, this fatherhood project, and I began telling Nathan about my dad, he immediately lit up, and I could tell that he loved his daddy more than anything in the world. It was just that clear to me, and we kind of had a kindred spirit about that. You know, both of us were preachers' kids. Both of us were deeply loved by our dads. You hear so much about preachers' kids these days. Well, there's 4 of them in this studio today, and I think all of us would say wonderful things about our dads who were preachers. So it's not every preacher's kid who's going astray, but it has everything to do with the way you as a preacher love your kids even more than you loved your job.
That's right.
And there's an interesting story I said we wanted to get to. Your dad actually did care about y'all, and you found that out in a kind of an interesting way. I want you to tell the story of the sacrifice your dad made for your family.
Well, my dad was reaching young people in a town in Mississippi called Hattiesburg, and he had a heart for young people. He just didn't know how to be a dad. Mm-hmm. He just had a heart for young people, and he was reaching about 1,500 young people a week in a stadium in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And a group of men found out about that and came to him and said, "We want to syndicate you or take you into full-time evangelism," which was his heart. Mm. And he asked them, he said, "Would I have to move?" And they said, "Yeah, you'd have to move." Mm. And he said, "I can't do that to my family." And they said, "Well, we're going to go after a young man named Billy Graham." Mm. And
I think I've heard of him.
I think you have. And when they went to Billy, they asked Billy, said, "Will you go into full-time evangelism?" And he goes, his first question was, "Am I your first choice?" Mm. And they said, "No." The first choice was Andy Gallman. And Billy said, "Well, I had to meet the man." Well, my daddy went to a crusade, met Billy, and my daddy became Billy Graham's prayer.
Wow.
He would go to his meetings and pray over him.
So even though your dad didn't know how to be a dad, he eventually figured that out. But deep inside, he really did love his family.
He did.
Enough to give up that kind of opportunity. And you got to think about the implications of that through the years. I mean, that's major.
It is.
That's a major. My dad gave up some opportunities. They weren't like that, but he gave up some opportunities, and that spoke so much to me that I was more important than career opportunities. So I think that's one of the greatest stories I've ever heard about a dad saying, "You know, my family's more important than my career." Would you do something for me? Would you tell for the listeners out there, for the young man who doesn't have a great relationship with his dad, or maybe doesn't know his dad at all, would you just speak to this camera here and tell him what's it going to take, and tell him that there's hope? And we don't have to retell your whole story, but just speak some encouragement into that young man, because I know there's a lot of them out there.
The thing that I would like for young men to hear is that your dad might not know how to tell you. He might not know how to talk to you. But deep in his heart, he loves you. And he's struggling with ways to explain his love to you. And there's no doubt in my mind that my dad didn't know how to be a dad because he lost his dad at 3. And many fathers today don't know how to be dads because their fathers were not in their life. But you find a young man or young lady that their father's been in their life, and you see the difference that a dad makes and a mother makes in their life, it changes the perspective of life. When my dad told me for the first time, "I love you, son," it changed my perspective. It changed my understanding of life. And if I could say anything to young men and young ladies, change perspective of your children. Tell them you love them. Tell them what it means to be loved. And then show them that love.
We have a little surprise for you. We got with your kids, kind of snuck around your back, and we want to share a few little pieces of video with you before we close out.
Okay.
My dad is a mentor, a friend, spiritual leader, and sometimes comic relief. I can remember my dad as a crazy youth director who loved to be as embarrassing as humanly possible. I can remember my dad and his special boldness because he knew his power in God. My dad is my hero, and I love him very much.
Honestly, when I think about Dad, there are so many stories that I could share, so many memories that I have and funny stories that would make you laugh. But the first one that I thought of was actually the day that I got my first speeding ticket. So I was driving from home to college, trying so hard to make it back to this class that I needed to be at. I had a really terrible grade and I needed to be in class this day. To give you more of a picture, it was the day after my grandmother's funeral, and so I had a rough weekend and was really trekking it. And if you know anything about Taylor Gallman, you know that he taught me how to drive, which means that I was definitely speeding. So I got pulled over and deserved every bit of the speeding ticket that I got. Of course, afterwards, I was super nervous and frazzled. My first call was Dad. And when I explained the situation to him, in true Taylor Gallman fashion, he responded much differently than he could have with, "Don't worry about it this time. I've got it covered." And that was way more than I deserved, because I definitely deserved to pay that speeding ticket. But that's not the first time that that's happened. Honestly, anytime that I bring up something that I think I might receive judgment for from Dad, or that I think he might be angry at me for, that's not the response that I get. I actually get a whole lot of grace. And it's a pretty clear picture of God the Father to me. It's just because that's who he is.
One of the best memories that I have with my dad is when we randomly decided to go to a Birmingham Barons baseball game. We had to buy tickets on the way to the game because it was so last minute. We were sitting on the third baseline and a foul ball was hit over our head, and everybody kind of turned around to look at it, but my dad decided to stay sitting and facing straight. He was watching the guy in front of us. And when the guy in front of us turned around to watch the ball, he was mid-sip into his beer. And my dad looked at him in the eyes and said, "You're not ready to get a divorce, are you?" And it absolutely shook this man to the point he literally spit his beer all over the people around us. And for the next 2 hours that we were at that game, my dad sat there and counseled and prayed for that man who was just in a tragic marriage. And we found out later that because of some of the stuff that my dad helped him walk through, he was able to save his marriage. They went into marriage counseling, they got healing, and they got involved in a church. And that's just one of the many stories that I have about my dad going out of his way to make sure that he can help people around him. Because no matter where we went, no matter where we were, whether it was a baseball game, Walmart, a vacation halfway across the world, my dad would always take time to pray for the people around him.
Some may think of Taylor Gallman as a son to world-traveled pastors, brother to missionaries and ministers, husband to worship leaders and teachers, father to 4 healthy children, counselor to many, pastor to a lot, missionary around the world, and faithful prayer warrior. And he is all that. But when I think of Taylor Gallman, well, that's my dad.
That's my dad.
That's my dad.
That's my dad.
So I just want to get your reaction.
Wow. I just think that even though you didn't have a great role model, you can be a role model. Yeah. And I made a promise to myself and I made a promise to God that I would love my children no matter what, and that they would know that they were loved not only by me but by God. I'm so proud of all of my children, and I believe that I've sowed seeds of life into them, and they're letting those seeds grow up now and become a seed to other people, a witness to other people. And if I could say anything to dads today, sow your seed into your children and let it flourish, and make sure that it's in great soil so that it can grow in the righteousness of God.
It's great advice. So if you're a young dad, or maybe you're going to be someday, here's a great example. A guy that grew up with not the best circumstance, but he turned things around. You know, one day we're all going to, if we're fortunate, we'll all be old enough to have adult children. And what a blessing it is that your adult children, we didn't have to twist their arm or pay them. But what a blessing that they would say those kind of things about their dad. So if you're a young dad, just want you to know you can have that same blessing. It's not that complicated. It's not that complicated. But one day you could just experience what Taylor just experienced with his kids. Congratulations. You've done a great job. Your kids love you. They think the world of you. I think the world of Nathan. Thank you for training him and preparing him for this, to go on this venture with us. And thank you for being here and sharing your story.
Thank you for letting me. It's been a blessing.
Thanks. That concludes this episode of That's My Dad. We'll be back next week with another great story. I hope this one has helped you. It's been touching to me, and I've even learned something. So, till next week, we'll see you then.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. This has been the That's My Dad podcast with our host, Scott Hilton, where we're on a mission to break the cycle of generational fatherlessness and inspire fathers to become great dads. We'll be back here every Monday night at 6 p.m. We'll see you then.